It's a new day. You wake up and go to work. You report to your boss and your manager. You have a new assignment. You are to find new recruits meeting certain specifications. You are to do this on a regular interval when you will be assessed. If you do well, you will be rewarded, but only so much so to make your job easier and no more. If you do poorly, you will be swiftly replaced. Day in, day out, you play your role as a good citizen and do your job, until, by happenstance, you experience something that doesn't quite fit. A stranger presents you with a wildly differing perspective. You learn something that contradicts what your superiors say. You see the plight of those below you in this social hierarchy. You're reminded of a time before this was your life. A seed of doubt begins to sprout in your mind. When did you consent to this? Were you ever presented a real choice in this matter at all? Why do you spend your time laboring away, not for your benefit, but for entities far more powerful than you? And by doing this, aren't you just helping them further consolidate power? Do those below you in this hierarchy, who endure a cruel and unforgiving existence, truly deserve their place? Or is this just a self-serving rationalization, a callousness that greases the gears of these mechanisms? What do you do when you are confronted with these doubts? Do you bury them, put your head down, and get back to work? Or do you pull on these threads, no matter how unsettling it feels to see supposed truths begin to unravel? Your path is not decided by a singular, one-time, either-or decision. It is instead the summation of many smaller steps, actions which in the moment may seem inconsequential. And the way forward is not always clear. But in the end, you must decide which path to walk. Do you follow the design set before you by your superiors, or do you create your own? Valkyrie Profile is revolutionary. I don't say this to be attention-grabbing, although I admit it does make for a provocative video title. I say this as a statement of fact, and you're probably a little bewildered by this. Let's not even start with the big word there. You might be thinking that I meant to say Valkyrie Profile was revolutionary. After all, the game came out 22 years ago. But first off, I think we can safely say that Valkyrie Profile didn't have much impact outside of being a cult classic. It did garner a direct sequel 6 years later on the PlayStation 2, a spin-off for the Nintendo DS 2 years after that, and a gacha-style mobile game that only survived about a year outside of Japan. In short, Valkyrie Profile was just big enough to become a franchise, albeit a humble and modest one at that. So, much to my delight, I was surprised when Square Enix recently announced a sequel, remake, reboot, reimagining, titled Valkyrie Elysium. Now, this announcement hasn't exactly been an earth-shaking social media firestorm return for the franchise. But again, Valkyrie Profile wasn't a massively popular genre-defining classic like, I don't know, Dante's Inferno, or For Honor, or The Order 1886. But like many IP revivals today, the people writing the checks at Square Enix wanted a new game, one outside of Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest at least, but also didn't want to start from scratch on the brand cachet. So here we are with Elysium launching on PlayStation consoles on September 29th, alongside a re-release of the original Valkyrie Profile, which, if I planned it right, is very soon after I finish and publish this video essay.
Our work is done.
All that said, let's get back to the seemingly outlandish statement that I made here. What exactly am I saying when I say Valkyrie Profile is revolutionary? I mean that Valkyrie Profile advocates against the status quo. Valkyrie Profile is harshly critical of hegemonic power, of systems of oppression and domination, of social and political hierarchies. Valkyrie Profile shows the injustice and cruelty of these regimes, and presents their demise as a good thing. Valkyrie Profile endorses revolution. But, you might ask, is that really anything special for a JRPG from 1999? Role-playing games from Japan have featured narratives opposing powerful people and institutions since the early days of the genre. Final Fantasy VI, a game I am contractually obligated to mention in all of my videos, shows us the horrors of empire, massacres, slavery, forced experimentation, all of which metastasizes into the nihilistic fascism of one Kefka Palazzo. Its successor stops just short of being an anti-capitalist polemic, a game whose heroes do an eco-terrorism or two against a weapons manufacturer turned power company. And this is to say nothing of JRPG's grand tradition, which you could call cliche, but you'd be wrong, of attacking and dethroning God. Where Valkyrie Profile differs most notably from its contemporaries is in its approach. Not only does its narrative conceit starkly differentiate itself from the typical RPG setup, it also finds a way to use gameplay to reinforce its themes. Let's get into it. Most role-playing games follow the hero's journey, sometimes quite literally as their player characters embark on an epic journey around the game world. Valkyrie Profile stands out in that it doesn't really follow this pattern. Well, I guess you could stretch some of the story beats to fit the old monomyth, but such an effort says more about the deficiencies of the hero's journey as an analytic lens, and also as a writing template, Dan, but I don't have the time to get into that right now. Let's take a closer look at Valkyrie Profile's story, particularly its setting and its unique structure. At the start of the game, we learn that Ragnarok is fast approaching, and in response, Lord Odin has awakened his trusty old Valkyrie Lenneth to mosey on down to Midgard and wrangle up some souls of brave warriors to fight for the gods in the upcoming tussle. Why am I talking like this? Now, Valkyrie Profile plays fast and loose with Norse mythology, so Ragnarok, as described by Odin here, is a war between his faction, the Aesir, and the faction led by Surt, who for some reason are called the Vanir. If you're a stickler for Norse mythology, your head is probably exploding at this point. Let's just say that there's a few creative liberties taken in this adaptation. The important thing here is that Odin's need for troops creates the narrative frame that our gameplay operates within. There is a finite amount of time between the start of the game and Ragnarok, partitioned into 8 chapters. Each chapter is further divided into periods, with every time we visit a town or dungeon taking 1 and 2 periods each respectively. And yeah, that's an interesting word choice for an interval of time. This English localization leaves a lot to be desired. Each chapter, Freya briefs Lenneth about what sort of skills and abilities that Asgard needs in its recruits. In the core game loop, Lenneth uses her powers of concentration to hone in on a town or city where a candidate is about to die. Here we see a vignette of their life, especially their final moments, before we recruit them, or recruit their soul, I guess. Lenneth also senses the locations of dungeons on the world map. As Freya instructs us, clearing these areas of the undead and other evil forces is a chance to train our Einherjar, readying them for the war against the Vanir. Once a character is built up enough, they can be transferred to Valhalla to fulfill Freya's request. At the end of each chapter, Freya assesses the player on how well the transferred Einherjar met the desired criteria, along with a couple of other player interactions that impact Lenneth's evaluation score. Freya and Odin then reward Lenneth according to this score. The cycle then repeats with Freya outlining what sort of soldier that Lenneth needs to recruit, develop, and send up during the next chapter. So by now you might be seeing that this is not a conventional story with an inciting incident, rising action, and all that jazz. It's something else entirely. And you've probably already guessed what this is, because that opening bit I did was really unsubtle. Or you just read the title of this video chapter. I'm not really good at this whole reveal thing, huh? This is a job. This is work. This core game loop resembles punch clock intervals, bosses demanding deliverables, and quarterly performance reviews. In a medium that is full of heroic power fantasies and respecting player choice and freedom, this is so mundane as to be remarkable. Lenneth just wakes up suddenly, gets told that she has a job to do, and just starts doing it without question. And if Lenneth fails to fulfill her duties to Freya's standards, that is, if the player's evaluation score drops too low, the result is getting fired. In this case, being violently replaced by her elder sister, Hrist, a non-standard game over, which is one of the game's 3 endings, ending C. An ending C implies that there are A and B endings, and it's in them that we begin to see Valkyrie Profile weave its themes through both narrative and gameplay. If failing at the job of a Valkyrie brings on ending C, you might be thinking that the best ending, ending A, is achieved by performing Lenneth's duties as best as possible. But this is not the case. In fact, if you attentively follow Freya's instructions and only do what is asked of you, you almost assuredly will find yourself here, Jotunheim Palace, the beginning of ending B.
This is the final battle. You must be victorious at all costs.
The Aesir have driven the Vanir back to their last stronghold and are now besieging them. We control Lenneth and her Einherjar as she leads the Aesir vanguard storming the gates of Jotunheim. Here we cut through the ranks of the Vanir and eventually reach their leader Surt and commence the final battle of the game. Despite this grandiose description, everything about this feels so unremarkable, anticlimactic, rote. It's just another dungeon, albeit with some trickier than usual platforming sections and an optional boss in blue. The fight with Surt himself doesn't seem all that different from the dozen or so boss fights we've fought previously. There's no gimmick to speak of, and aside from his huge health pool, Surt goes down without much difficulty. After all is said and done, all we get is a simple pat on the back from Freya. Good job, enjoy your weekend, see you next week. Roll credits. Aside from a brief coda hinting that there's something more to this story, that's all, folks. I must remark, this ending is gutsy in a way. Gutsy in the sense that it appears to be going out of its way to disappoint the player, who did nothing wrong according to the game logic presented to them. And to tell your players, if you want the canonical ending, try again after 20 or so hours of gameplay is really trolling, not going to lie. It's akin to something I like to call anti-design, which is a topic for a future video. So what's the point of deliberately dissatisfying players in this manner? Well, I think the team at Tri-Ace are deliberately using the banality of this ending to make a point, which will become much more apparent once we examine ending A. Banality. Where have I heard that word before? There are 4 criteria required for ending A. 1. Completing the Tower of Lizard Valeth by the end of Chapter 4. 2. Recruiting Lucian and Mystina in Chapter 5. 3. Transferring Lucian to Asgard before the end of Chapter 6. And 4. Lowering Lenneth's seal value to 37 or below at the start of Chapter 7. The first 3 of these are very easy to do if we're following Lenneth's concentration prompts, completing all the dungeons and recruiting all the characters that are set before us. Lucian's traits and naturally high hero value align him neatly with Freya's requirements for the Chapter 5 Einherjar, incentivizing us to send him up. It's this 4th criterion where things get a bit tricky. The first thing to note is that Lenneth's seal value is different from her evaluation rating, the latter being what Freya and Odin use to grade the player. The seal value is shown at the bottom of Lenneth's status screen here. Even if you did notice this without someone else pointing it out, it's very easy for the seal value and the evaluation rating to both be at 100 early in the game, so it's quite natural to think that they're the same stat. While the game allows us to see the seal value, despite tucking it away in an infrequently used menu, it's a bit of a black box. The game doesn't communicate how or what manipulates it. By virtue of completing the first 3 criteria for ending A, we're likely to have a seal value hovering somewhere in the 50s or 60s. So in order to meet the 4th criterion, we're going to need to knock off another 15 to 30 points. The key takeaway here, the reason why I'm bringing up these mechanical details in the first place, is that in order to get its true ending, Valkyrie Profile requires us to investigate places outside the ones it explicitly points us toward. One such location makes a lot of sense if you happen to watch the optional prologue, which shows us the backstory of Lucian. Why this is an optional cutscene instead of the terrible, unskippable 45-minute start of the game is anyone's guess.
You knew the princess would be unconscious if she was found. The medicine's effect was as you see. The princess became a monster, and afterwards all were dead.
The other locations are probably going to require a little bit of trial and error to stumble upon. Visiting Garabellum before recruiting Lucian is, well, not obvious. But if you're paying close attention to the world map, you might notice Brahm's Castle emerging as an option starting in Chapter 3. It's not a perfect way to go about it, but the game is rewarding us for our curiosity and independence. And this resonates deeply with Valkyrie Profile's narrative themes. Remember how I said this was not a conventional story? Well, I lied. But not really. I do think what we see on the way to ending B is not what most folks would consider to be a story. Rather, the real story of Valkyrie Profile is buried within this path to ending A. One way to frame this is that ending B is essentially what happens if the hero refuses the call and doesn't continue along the hero's journey. Whereas in ending A, Lenneth finally answers the call at the end of Chapter 8. Now, I really want to get into thematic analysis of this story, but in order to do so, we're going to need a quick summary of the major beats for ending A, so here goes. Our prologue focuses on a young girl, Platina, who lives in the poor rural village of Coriander. Her friend Lucian has learned that Platina's mother plans to sell her into slavery. This leads the 2 children to run away in the middle of the night, where they stumble upon the Weeping Lily Meadow. Here, Platina succumbs to the poisonous pollen of the flowers and dies. As it turns out, Valkyrie spirits are not active and awake all of the time, and while they are dormant, they are reincarnated as humans down on Midgard. Platina is, of course, one such reincarnation of our player character Lenneth. Odin and Freya have sealed away these human memories, which they believe would be a hindrance to Lenneth's job as a Valkyrie. Given that the work is something of a fusion between military recruiter and police officer, it follows that anything that might stir empathy and compassion for those lowly humans would get in the way of the enlistment efforts. Lucian, upon being recruited and transferred, remarks about how much Lenneth resembles Platina. The 2 share a kiss in a tender but also somewhat stilted scene. Once up in Valhalla, Lucian ruminates on this when he is approached by Loki. Loki presents Lucian with an opportunity to talk to Lenneth and send her one of Platina's earrings using the Water Mirror, a magical device the gods use to monitor and communicate with worlds outside of Asgard. Lenneth becomes enraged when Lucian contacts her. A mortal using the Water Mirror is a grave violation of the laws of Asgard, and to do so to send her what looks like a trivial trinket appears to her as the height of foolishness. Loki, being the trickster god that he is, has an ulterior motive for helping Lucian here, and summarily executes him in the name of Odin. Turns out that Loki has stolen one of the 4 treasures from Valhalla, the Dragon Orb, and framed Lucian to divert suspicion away from him. The 4 treasures are a bit of additional world building that Valkyrie Profile has done on top of Norse myths here. Each treasure corresponds to one of the 4 worlds of Yggdrasil, acting as a sort of load-bearing existential MacGuffin for its respective world. The first of these comes directly from the source material. Odin's spear Gungnir is the treasure of Asgard. The Dragon Orb is Midgard's treasure. And if you're wondering why it is in Valhalla for Loki to steal instead of somewhere on Midgard, that's a sharp observation. Stick a pin in that. Speaking of Midgard, Lenneth is wrapping up her duties there when she stumbles upon the Weeping Lily Meadow. As she holds the earring Lucian sent her while standing over the grave of Platina, the seal on her human memories finally breaks. Lenneth is inundated with the realization of who she really is and what Lucian was trying to accomplish. Watching from Valhalla, Odin and Freya are alerted that their hold over Lenneth has diminished, but Freya quickly reassures Odin that
the security is operating normally.
It's looking a lot like Ending C all over again, with Lenneth's spirit being violently displaced from the Valkyrie vessel by her elder sister Hrist. Hrist is zealous and domineering, demanding Arngrim and Mystina swear fealty to her. When they refuse, she attempts to kill them. But in a fleeting moment, Lenneth's spirit appears in the way to save them. With Lenneth's soul scattered into wisps, Hrist decides to move on. Mystina, using her magic, frantically condenses what remains of Lenneth. Together with some unexpected help from Lizard Valeth and Brahms, our heroes successfully defeat Hrist and eventually piece Lenneth back together. Back in Asgard, we see Loki parleying with Surt, offering the stolen dragon orb and the help of two mythical beasts, and Fenrir, to the Vanir cause. Surt, in his pride, declines Loki's assistance. We're then left with the image of Loki smirking quite menacingly. Lenneth arrives in Valhalla and we see that Ragnarok, the real one this time, is underway, thanks to Loki. Frey reveals to Lenneth that Loki stole the dragon orb from Valhalla, which was only there because Odin had appropriated it from Midgard beforehand. Frey further expounds upon the rationale for this. Odin was further consolidating his power, and that without its treasure, Midgard would fall into chaos, increasing the supply of human souls to recruit as Einherjar. Afterward, finding Freya hunched over a mortally wounded Odin, Lenneth confronts them.
I no longer have to obey commands from you. The whole reason that this final battle is occurring at all is because Odin stole that orb in the first place.
Lenneth then pursues Loki, who has gone all chaotic evil, must destroy everything, edgelord, yada yada yada, you know the drill. Loki goes ahead and does the thing, using the power of the dragon orb to obliterate Asgard and Midgard. But Lenneth somehow survives this destruction. As it turns out, her reconstruction involved the homunculus that Lizard made, and his particular hypothesis has proven correct. Lenneth, now a hybrid of god and mortal, has grown more powerful than the deities of Asgard ever were. With this awesome power, Lenneth recreates the world, smites Loki, and reunites with Lucian. The end. Whew. Okay, that was a lot, even glossing over a lot of the details to get to the main story beats. So what does this all mean thematically? I have 3 different readings I would like to present you with. One thing I find curious is the relationship between Midgard and Asgard, especially when looking at Asgard's interactions with the other worlds of Yggdrasil. We see these interactions through our Einherjar's assignments in Valhalla. Freya asks us to send a negotiator for a trip to Alfheim to convince the elves to lend their world's treasure to the Aesir war effort. Another mission involves our Einherjar attacking and capturing Niflheim and its queen, the goddess Hel.
It seems that the Vanir have joined forces with those of Niflheim. If we do not do something, we will be in great danger. We must strike while the iron is hot. Go at once to Niflheim and capture the goddess Hel.
Asgard does not treat Midgard like an ally, as it does with Alfheim, nor does Asgard treat it as a pariah state like Niflheim. In fact, Asgard does not recognize the sovereignty of Midgard at all. Odin and the gods of Valhalla instead view Midgard as a realm they are entitled to plunder resources from, paying no mind to the concerns of humans living there. The most immediate resource is the steady flow of human souls conscripted by Lenneth, or whoever the active Valkyrie of the time is. We never see someone refuse or resist being drafted in this way, so it's not entirely clear what the consequences for doing so are. But given that Lenneth only mentions one alternate destination for the dead, I think we can infer that objectors would be sent to Niflheim for an eternity of torture instead. So either go up to Valhalla to work for the gods, or endure unending agony. Sounds a bit like slavery, right? Quick editing time addendum here. As I was going through the footage, I noticed that Lenneth actually explicitly makes this threat to Gandar. Now, this might be a special situation in the case that Gandar is kind of a despicable person, and Lenneth was planning to send him to Niflheim anyhow. But it does kind of show that Lenneth has the capability to coerce people to become Einherjar. And I do call this slavery, and I do think it qualifies because it is coerced labor, but I do want to make the distinction that this is not chattel slavery. Anyhow, back to the script. When clearing dungeons in Valkyrie Profile, we come across another resource: artifacts. We are told that these artifacts are property of Lord Odin, and refusing to promptly send them up to Asgard docks our evaluation rating. Is the Allfather just so clumsy that he's left so many of his priceless items strewn about Midgard? Or are we instead expropriating historical heirlooms and ornaments from Midgard? Does Valhalla have its equivalent of the British Museum up there full of all this grave-robbed plunder? Funny that I should mention the British Museum, because this relationship between these two worlds reminds me of something. Asgard is the imperial core of this world, or world tree, I suppose, a hegemonic state that holds disproportionate power, wealth, and influence for its relative size and population. This imbalance is both the cause and effect of an ongoing and intense extraction of resources from nations in what's known as the imperial periphery.
The wealth of the imperialist nations is our own wealth. At a universal level, such a statement in no way means we feel implicated to the technical feats or artistic creations of the West. In concrete terms, Europe has been bloated out of all proportions by the gold and raw material from such colonial countries such as Latin America, China, and Africa. Today, Europe's tower of opulence faces these continents. For centuries, the point of departure of their shipments of diamonds, oil, silk, and cotton, timber, and exotic produce to this very same Europe. Europe is literally the creation of the Third World. The riches which are choking it are those plundered from the underdeveloped peoples.
Such exploitation can occur as the result of military invasion and occupation, using force to demand tribute from the natives. But this is a risky prospect and can be unpopular even in the imperial core countries that benefit from it. Imperial powers have instead become far more sly and crafty in their efforts to rob the imperial periphery's wealth. One technique along these lines, as the previous quote from Frantz Fanon alludes to, is the practice of underdevelopment.
What is called underdevelopment is a set of social relations that has forcefully been imposed on countries. With the advent of the Western colonizers, the peoples of the Third World were actually set back in their development, sometimes for centuries. British imperialism in India provides an instructive example. In 1810, India was exporting more textiles to England than England was exporting to India. By 1830, the trade flow was reversed. By 1850, India's debt had grown to £53 million. From 1850 to 1900, its per capita income dropped by almost 2/3. The value of the raw materials and commodities the Indians were obliged to send to Britain during most of the 19th century amounted yearly to more than the total income of the 60 million Indian agricultural and industrial workers. The massive poverty we associate with India was not that country's original historical condition. British imperialism did two things. First, it ended India's development, then it forcibly underdeveloped that country.
In short, imperial powers use sabotage and predatory lending to leave the imperial periphery in a state of perpetual debt and dependency. The imperial core then leverages this debt to coerce the imperial periphery to surrender land, labor, and resources. If you're curious how this works in the real world, look no further than the loans granted by the International Monetary Fund to quote-unquote poor countries. And when a nation in the imperial periphery rejects or protests such lopsided dealing and begins working towards its own sovereignty and autonomy, we see intervention from the imperial core. Sometimes this intervention is direct military force, other times it's subversion and covert action. For instance, it's been verified that the United States was directly involved in the overthrow of, at least, 7 governments around the world. Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, the Congo in 1960, the Dominican Republic in 1961, South Vietnam in 1963, Brazil in 1964, and Chile in 1973. I say at least because those are just the coups that the CIA readily admits to. Valkyrie Profile captures this behavior in the story of the lost city of Dappan. Dappan, under the leadership of King Barbarossa, was acquiring the means to assert independence from Asgard's rule. Seeing this, Odin sent his Valkyrie Hrist to quell this rebellion and to reassert the god's claim over Midgard by terrorizing Dappan. Hrist promptly captures Barbarossa and executes him in front of his subjects. Dappan subsequently falls into chaos and eventual ruin. It's clear that if a policy or action would bring about more efficient extraction, that is, further accumulating and consolidating wealth and power in the imperial core, you can bet that its members will pursue it at some point. Even if it is something as catastrophic as, say, destabilizing a country or an entire region in the imperial periphery.
And finally, 2 weeks ago, on January 23rd, Burkina Faso's army leaders, led by a U.S.-trained commander, deposed the nation's president, suspended the constitution, and dissolved parliament. That's 6 coups in 5 African countries in just under a year and a half. Over the weekend, the African Union condemned the recent wave of military coups. This is Ghana's president, Nana Akufo-Addo.
The resurgence of coups d'etats in our region is in direct violation of our democratic tenets and represents a threat to peace, security, and stability in West Africa.
The political unrest and tumult of today's Africa is no accident, as powerful imperial nations continue to extract rare earth metals, precious minerals, as well as agricultural goods such as coffee and cocoa from the continent. In Valkyrie Profile, Odin steals the Dragon Orb, not just to enhance the Aesir arsenal, but to deliberately destabilize Midgard in this manner. Such an act would surely increase the availability of human souls he could enlist in his army going forward. To see exactly how devastating Odin's misdeed is here, Valkyrie Profile 2 gives us a glimpse of Midgard at the time right up until the Dragon Orb was expropriated. While not a utopia by any means, we see that Midgard and its inhabitants enjoyed a fair amount of peace and prosperity, a stark contrast to its later degradation. In VP2, we see neither the widespread war between Midgard's nation-states nor a hint of the very active slave trade that is present in VP1. By Lenneth's time, nothing remains of Soldi except its catacombs, and we see noticeable dilapidation of the surviving towns and cities. Letting an entire world collapse into conflagration and misery solely for one's personal gain reveals an outstanding deficiency of empathy. This scene with Frey does a spectacular job of not just delivering exposition, but also showing how obliviously callous the gods are.
I think Lord Odin was planning to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. The orb has great powers, and without it, Midgard will fall into chaos. And that would also make your job easier, Lenneth.
Stop it!
Why do you say that, Lenneth?
Nothing. Forget it.
Freya further showcases Asgard's chauvinism and disregard, equating Odin's deadly policy toward humanity with the course of nature. But the division between gods and humans may be greatly overstated, as libertarian Harry Potter describes here.
Listen well, Misty. It's possible to transfer human souls into elves. There it is, conclusive proof that gods and human souls are roughly equivalent beings.
Here in the real world, the horrors wrought by the imperialism of the Anglosphere and Western Europe have been excused by a similarly bogus pretension: white supremacy. Without doing a deep dive into sociology or anthropology, I can't say whether this callousness is the product of this imbalance of power or a requirement for it. It's a bit of a chicken or egg scenario. But what does appear to be true is that as this disparity grows, so does this ruthless disregard for the humanity of others, creating a vicious feedback loop. It should be unsurprising then that the real-world imperialism that we see today is driven by capitalism, a system that demands growth and accumulation of wealth without concern for anything else. So let me put this question to you. What is the end game of capitalism? When will capitalism say, hey, that's enough, it's time to stop? Such a system consolidates power and wealth into fewer and fewer hands until a very tiny subset of humanity have everything and everyone else has nothing. It should be pretty obvious then that such a system is, not sustainable.
And here it becomes evident that the bourgeoisie is unfit any longer to be the ruling class in society and to impose its conditions of existence upon society as an overriding law. It is unfit to rule because it is incompetent to assure an existence to its slave within his slavery, because it cannot help letting him sink into such a state that it has to feed him instead of being fed by him. Society can no longer live under this bourgeoisie. In other words, its existence is no longer compatible with society. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all is its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable.
It is this insatiable greed and continued accumulation of wealth and power in Valhalla that brings about Ragnarok. In this case, it is not a proletariat uprising, but Loki, a lesser god seizing the power that Odin had already purloined. Earlier I mocked his characterization as the cliched, lazy, chaotic evil villain archetype, but when playing through this final confrontation again, I noticed something interesting.
You cannot use your full power because your friends are here. Odin died protecting Freya, Lenin. What about you? If you use the true power of the divine treasures, the blood of heroes will be on your own hands. I live only for myself. Even holding the sacred treasure, your mercy shall prove to be your downfall.
Loki here represents the logical extreme of the imperialist capitalist mindset. His path to power follows that of Odin's, but he has played through straight to the inevitable conclusion of this worldview. This practice of concentrating power is inherently destructive, and to advance to the point of putting all the power into a singular individual would be nothing short of a cataclysm, which it proves to be. Loki's dialogue here further ties his calamitous actions with this intensely individualistic ideology.
Such power! Wonderful! Yes, Lenin, yes! That's right! Use all the power for yourself. Try to protect the others and you will only guarantee your own death.
Loki, embodying this voracious egocentrism of imperialism, sets this final battle up as a dialectical clash. And to counter the apotheosis of greed and domination and hatred, Lenneth becomes the epitome of empathy and cooperation and love.
I are one and the same.
I hear them.
What?
The voices of all the living souls of Midgard. And I feel them. I feel all of their pain.
What? What is this power?
This power. It is from all of you.
Indeed, what causes Lenneth the Creator to emerge and immediately undo the damage done by Loki is her newfound compassion for all life and all worlds. Her power comes not from her godhood, but rather from reconnecting with her humanity. She has literally and figuratively become the fusion of gods and humans, a person both of Asgard and of Midgard. If you're watching this video, you're probably like me and living here in the real-world Imperial core. What Valkyrie Profile is inviting us to examine is our place in the cruel power structures that govern our world. Looking at Ending B with what we know from Ending A, we are confronted with how horrifying a world it would be for a tyrant like Odin to rule unopposed. But this is the world we live in. A world where imperialist systems of oppression and domination, capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, have had free reign for some time now. And if all we do is put our heads down, acting in complete compliance and complicity with these systems, we will find ourselves at our own bad ending. While the task of dismantling these power structures is immense and daunting, we should take solace in the fact that, by their nature, they cannot last forever, and that our resistance to them will accelerate their demise. When their time comes, it will be upon us, humans, not gods, to create their replacements. This will be our chance to create a world of equality instead of disparity, a world of cooperation instead of exploitation, a world of liberty instead of domination.
Ladies and gentlemen, shit's about to hit the fan. This is
Feminism in Video Games.
Yes. It's time to apply some feminist perspective to a video game, which will surely result in calm, level-headed, and thoroughly considered discussion in my comments section. Oh. So, is Valkyrie Profile feminist? Well, at first blush, it certainly seems that way. We've got our strong female protagonist. Lenneth is a skilled fighter with both sword and bow, leads and commands her Einherjar, and is generally stalwart and brave. She also goes on to become the most powerful entity in the narrative. Her character design is classy and tasteful, her armor looks practical without sacrificing feminine flourishes such as a skirt and her long, flowing hair. Her fellow women player characters are also treated with respect, most written as their own people with agency and goals that aren't tethered directly to male characters. Their concepts are also largely devoid of the male gaze, presenting them in attire and poses that speak to their characters and their abilities. They're, at the very least, way better than whatever the hell this is from Valkyrie Profile 2, or how Lenneth always seems to be pulling a Marilyn Monroe and standing over a conspicuously placed industrial fan in recent artwork. Adding to this, the game presents practically every male authority figure in a bad light, including the all-daddy himself, Odin. How did that get in the script? The only notable exception to this is King Barbarossa, who from all accounts was loved by the people of Japan and was acting in their best interest. But the rest of the kings and patriarchs are presented as cruel, self-interested authoritarians. So Valkyrie Profile checks the boxes. It depicts a woman fulfilling the strong, courageous hero archetype. Women throughout the game are presented in sensible and practical attire and aren't posing for the camera like sex objects. It shows us men bad, women good. Heck, it passes the Bechdel test. That's a feminism, right? Well, not really. The first 2 points are externalities that certainly align with feminist goals, but their presence in a work doesn't necessarily mean the work itself is feminist. The third point is a gross oversimplification and frequent straw woman of feminist thought. Even the most ardent radical feminists who say things that may literally resemble men bad, women good, are making a far more nuanced argument. And as far as the Bechdel test goes, well, I'll get to that in a minute. What is feminism then? Well, given that feminist philosophy spans centuries with several waves and dozens of ideological branches, trying to condense it down to a singular notion is reductive, like by definition. But for our purposes here, I will define feminism as an ideology that seeks to create an egalitarian society by dismantling patriarchy, the long-standing oppressive social system that disproportionately advantages men over women and people of other genders. A quick way to illustrate the patriarchal nature of our culture is to think about how we speak of the recently deceased. When we talk about a dead man, the first thing discussed is usually his work, his achievements, and so on. When we talk about a dead woman, all too often the first description of her is her relationship to a man. She was a mother or daughter or wife or sister, etc. Coming back to the Bechdel test, its criteria are very easy. The media in question must have at least 2 named women characters in it, who talk to each other about something besides a man. I hope it's obvious that this is an incredibly low bar to clear. It's practically subterranean. That's because the Bechdel test was not about assessing an individual piece of media, but the media landscape in aggregate. When Alison Bechdel formulated it in 1985, the overwhelming majority of movies failed this extremely easy test. Now, the numbers have improved since then, but only in very recent decades have we actually comfortably surpassed 50% of movies passing the Bechdel test. Still not great. In short, the way that our fictional media still doesn't regularly treat women as full and complete human beings with rich internal lives illustrates patriarchy's deep roots within our culture. So patriarchy clearly advantages men at the expense of women, but what underpins it? A better way of describing patriarchy is as a system that divides all of humanity into 2 categories, the masculine and the feminine. Further, it prizes and fully humanizes masculinity while it denigrates and dehumanizes femininity. This reasoning, of course, percolates up from abstract concepts to living, breathing human beings. Under patriarchy, men are considered the default and women exist at and for the pleasure of men. But this goes even deeper. Specific thoughts and emotions are also lumped under these gendered banners, and yet again, those deemed masculine are desired over the feminine. This is what is known as psychological patriarchy.
The pattern of psychological patriarchy can be envisioned as a set of 3 concentric rings surrounding each of us as individuals. The first of these rings is a process in which all the properties granted to us by nature, the elements of one whole personality, are bifurcated. It is as if we as a culture have taken a blank piece of paper and drawn a line down its center, declaring all characteristics to the right of the line masculine, and all those to the left feminine. On the masculine side lie such qualities as strength, logic, aggression, anti-dependence, goal orientation, and insensitivity. On the feminine side lie such qualities as weakness, emotion, yielding, dependence, process orientation, and oversensitivity.
This is why you'll frequently find feminists are the harshest critics of the girl boss and the aforementioned strong female protagonist tropes. Whatever elevation women gain in the social hierarchy as a result of these notions is just superficial tokenism. The underlying prejudice against femininity, women, and the unmasculine has not gone away. The strong female protagonist simply trades the gruff, hyper-masculine exterior of the typical male action hero for a female facade, with all of the traits and behaviors under the hood remaining the same. In short, the SFP is not a repudiation of patriarchy. Instead, it's a rebranding and repackaging of masculine supremacy that recuperates a supposedly feminist aesthetic. Argel Lenneth here is one such SFP. Well, before she regains her memories and ending A anyhow. She is, of course, a warrior and goal-oriented in her duties. She is cold, matter-of-fact, and very reserved emotionally, only expressing indignation with any sort of energy.
Humans who seek to cross beyond their designated boundaries invite more than death. They invite total annihilation.
She seems uncomfortable with love and intimacy.
This is not my task. I am no goddess of love. You see a semblance of your first love when you look at me. But there's a chasm between men and gods that cannot be traversed.
And when we look at what Valhalla values in our characters, we see how these patriarchal traits are considered positive and more traditionally feminine traits are considered negative.
Send us a courageous warrior who can lead. Cowards are useless to us. Only the bravest may fight for Odin.
Between chapters, we can look into our Einherjar's deeds. In one instance, Lucian takes mercy on a wounded Vanir and allows him to flee back to the ranks of the enemy. This act of compassion docks his hero value by 10 points. We see similar sentiments expressed when we recruit Suo. Suo meets his end because he couldn't bring himself to attack and kill civilians. This earns him posthumous scorn from his superior officer and from Lenneth as well.
Why didn't you fight?
I was thinking.
Thinking?
I was trying to figure out how it all came to this. Raising swords against women and children. We say it is right, for our objective is just. But how many defenseless people have been slaughtered? All I wanted to do was protect the very ones I cut down. All I wanted to do was protect the people who could not protect themselves.
So maybe Valkyrie Profile isn't feminist after all? Well, that would be the case if the game was playing the strong female protagonist trope and these hero values straight without any further commentary. It should be noted that the hero values are coming from the same place as Lenneth's evaluation rating. They are diegetic scores that reflect how Odin, Freya, and the rest of the gods judge our characters. And once we reach ending A, it becomes clear that Odin is far from benevolent, so maybe doing things that win his favor are not so good after all. We also learn that Lenneth's strong female protagonist persona is not her real self, and this artifice has caused her grief and harm. In particular, she feels immense guilt about her condemnation towards Lucian for using the water mirror, which led to his death. By having a woman exemplify this patriarchal prescription of masculinity, I believe the creators of Valkyrie Profile are using uncanniness and queerness to draw attention to it. Obviously, this is far less shocking now that the strong female protagonist trope has become far more prevalent in our media landscape nowadays, but for a video game in 1999, it had novelty. And the reason to draw attention to this masculine performance is to alert us to its harmfulness.
Those boys who try to step out of the box place themselves in harm's way, since even today, our culture's tolerance for young men who deviate from what we deem masculine is limited, and our intolerance expresses itself in singularly ugly ways. The great bind is that those boys who do not resist, who choose or who are coerced to comply, do not escape either. Avoiding attack from without, those who adopt the traditions of male stoicism and self-reliance risk injury to the deepest and most alive aspects of their own being. The consequence of opposition is psychological and often physical brutality. The consequence of compliance is emotional truncation, numbness, and isolation.
Perhaps partitioning all of human expression and experience into two groups, then overvaluing one at the expense of the other, is an extremely poisonous idea that harms all of us as individuals and as a collective. Perhaps we need both logic and sentiment. Perhaps we need both justice and compassion. Perhaps we need both strength and vulnerability. Perhaps we need to fulfill both our own needs and the needs of others. Perhaps it is healthy to experience and express the whole gamut of human emotion: joy and sorrow, determination and fear, love and anger, pride and regret, excitement and calm, conviction and doubt, and so on. Again, not only is the act of denying half of our humanity extremely toxic to us as individuals, it makes for one dysfunctional society.
You must not allow such human emotions to consume you. You will lose everything. What is this everything you speak of? Huh? How arrogant of you. Human emotions, you say? I feel pity for all of them. I wish to save them. Parting is truly a sorrow. Why can you not show such emotions toward humans as well?
When you step back and think about a culture predicated on domination and callousness and extreme individualism, you'll see that it must organize itself into a vertical hierarchy. And such a hierarchy can offer no peace and no security to anyone, not even those at the very top. Those who reached the summit of this hierarchy did so by taking it from someone else. They therefore understand quite clearly the precarity of their station. They must constantly foil the efforts of those below them while continuing to consolidate their power and authority ad infinitum, lest they be replaced atop the hierarchy. Thus, a patriarchal culture predicated on power and domination and conquest will eventually destroy itself. Indeed, the grand irony of Ragnarok for Odin was that it was his very act of hoarding power in preparation for it that brought it about. And it might seem like I'm repeating the conclusion from the prior section on imperialism here. And yeah, I am. These systems of domination share the same fate, and unsurprisingly are comorbid with one another. Such hierarchies of oppression all interlock with and reinforce each other. It does us no good to dismantle one system of oppression and domination while sparing others. For example, let's say we dismantle capitalism and imperialism but maintain patriarchy and white supremacy. Like a set of raid bosses that must all be defeated simultaneously, the surviving systems will reproduce the defunct ones before long. These reincarnations may take on a slightly different form, but functionally they will be the same. We must tear down all hierarchies and banish all notions of supremacy and domination to the shadow realm. Feminism is a struggle to end sexist oppression. Therefore, it is necessarily a struggle to eradicate the ideology of domination that permeates Western culture on various levels, as well as a commitment to reorganizing society so that the self-development of people can take precedence over imperialism, economic expansion, and material desires. Lenneth, who creates a new world from the ashes of this old order of patriarchy and empire, offers a glimpse of such an intersectional approach. By regaining her human memories, Lenneth rediscovers the empathy, compassion, and love that was taken from her and becomes whole. And it is these very feminine emotions that she extends to the downtrodden and the oppressed, correcting her previously warped moral compass. It is with this newfound clarity that she defeats Loki and sets the world right. If that last section didn't bring out all the troglodytes into my comments section, it's time to leave no doubt. So let's talk about the queer themes of Valkyrie Profile. Contrary to what many of the gamers today may think, queer representation in video games is not some new phenomenon seen only in recent years. The JRPG genre, while by no means immune from engaging in its own homophobia/transphobia/queerphobia, has quite a few examples of queer representation from its mainstream heyday of the late 1990s. Final Fantasy series had characters who either lack gender or are of ambiguous gender. And of course, Final Fantasy VII gave us Cloud's infamous cross-dressing scene and the possibility for him to go on a date with Barret. Another potential example of queer representation from around this time comes directly from Tri-Ace, the creators of Valkyrie Profile. Their previous title, Star Ocean: The Second Story, features a relationship mechanic where your main player character pairs with a party member at the end of the game. And it's possible to end up with a character of the same gender as your player character. The closest we get to unambiguous queer representation in Valkyrie Profile is our recruit Jayla. To sum it up, Jayla is doing a Mulan. Seeking to avenge her parents, she disguises herself as a man in order to join the knighthood, even falling in love with the knight commander along the way. But her story ends up a bit differently because, of course, she dies and becomes a Nine-Hairyar. What is curious is that even after recruiting her, she continues to go by her male moniker Jael, not her birth name Letitia. Is this textual, genderqueer, or trans representation? I would be very hesitant to say so, since the game continues to refer to Jael as a swordswoman. But it is interesting that Jael maintains her same masculine presentation even after becoming a Nine-Hairyar, when it serves no purpose for her anymore. Given Tri-Ace maybe depicted queerness in a positive light before, I believe it's remarkable enough. Given the ongoing social stigmas surrounding LGBTQIA+ people, it should not be surprising that queer readings of media focus on subtext or other elements which can be interpreted to suggest or imply queerness. I really don't care if these readings are expressly intended by the authors or are just elaborate post hoc constructions by the audience. I believe queer readings are valid and valuable expressions of humanity, including my own. If such a practice bothers you, I invite you to self-reflect on why exactly it does. As far as potentially implied queer characters go in Valkyrie Profile, the best candidates seem to be Laufer and Arngrim. This is mostly seen through Laufer's vignette before recruiting him. It is clear that Arngrim's death weighs heavily on his mind. Represented a scene of the two men sparring and another of them sitting atop a hill gazing at the horizon. Lawfer is especially concerned about Arngrim's younger brother Roland, who has been imprisoned due to Arngrim's suicidal rampage. He commits to freeing Roland, an act that will surely come at the cost of Lawfer's life. Now, I want to pump the brakes here a bit, because reading two textually platonic male friends as would-be gay lovers gets into some murky territory. Like, looking after a deceased friend's immediate family is just something we should all do, no matter the circumstances, truth be told. But I completely understand the desire to fill the gaps in both the story and in a media landscape that underrepresents and misrepresents queer people. Sometimes you just gotta cobble together your own representation, you know? However, I think this extra-textual casting of male friends as gay partners sometimes originates from the deep-seated homophobia within patriarchy.
Frodo! Frodo! Thought I'd lost you. Mr. Frodo's not going anywhere without me. I'm glad you're with me.
Instead of a celebration of tenderness and fondness and vulnerability, such a reading mocks these men as effeminate for not being completely stoic and adversarial towards one another. It is the same old toxic prescription of masculinity that we discussed in the previous section on patriarchy. Now, personally, I ship the hell out of these two. Part of that is that Arngrim is essentially a ripoff of Guts from Berserk, and Lawfer sort of resembles Griffith. And if you read Berserk, you would be familiar with the sexual tension between those two. So yeah, Arngrim and Lawfer are totally boyfriends and they're totally doing it. But I think just scanning through Valkyrie profile for potentially LGBTQIA+ characters doesn't quite do justice to its queer themes. To get into what I mean by that, let's elaborate on the concept of queerness.
Today, queer is used in two distinct yet interrelated senses. At its most basic, queer serves as an umbrella term for people and experiences that do not conform to mainstream norms of gender and sexuality. The second meaning of queerness is more conceptual. To be queer by this definition is to resist the hegemonic logics that dictate what it means to be an acceptable, valued, heteronormative, or homonormative subject. Queerness challenges dominant beliefs about pleasure and power. It names a longing to live life otherwise. In this sense, queerness is simultaneously a term for the lived experience of LGBTQ subjects and a term for a way of reimagining, resisting, and remaking the world.
Remaking the world, huh? Once again, we need to look at our main character. As mentioned before, Lenneth combines a lavishly feminine presentation with playing the traditional masculine role of a stoic, duty-bound, and logic-driven soldier. There's some potential problems with this interpretation, which we'll get to later, and again, I think we're missing something deeper by just looking at potential representation in this way. The mechanics behind her seal value provide a potential example of this conceptual queerness. Think about how most scores and evaluations work in real life and in games. Generally, higher scores are better in both. So it's interesting that Lenneth's seal value starts at 100 and presumably has a floor of 0. To put it another way, it's a grade. And to get Valkyrie Profile's true ending, we have to go from an A+ to an F. We have to resist the hegemonic logic and fail. This very easily could have been a value that we built up from 0 to 63 instead. So while I have no way to prove it, this inversion of logic appears deliberate, and having to reduce a score in this manner feels odd. It feels weird. It feels queer. Lenneth's story isn't necessarily or directly about being queer, but instead acts as a metaphor for the queer experience. In particular, an experience that is shared by most queer people. The repression of our authentic selves, the anguish of an artificial life, the peril of coming out, the joy of living and loving and being loved for who we truly are. Lenneth's memory of her life as Platina symbolizes what most queer people learn at a young age. We learn, whether consciously or instinctively, that we are different. And just as Odin and Freya sealed away Lenneth's human memories, Queer folk often find our true nature aggressively repressed early in our lives by parents or other authority figures. And frequently, as a result of trying to escape this onslaught of neglect and abuse, we come to deny, dismiss, and bury our authentic self in childhood. But truth is restless. It will always work its way toward the surface. To contradict one's true self is to walk on insecure, trembling ground.
But there's a chasm between men and gods that cannot be traversed. Thus, love between the two is not possible. However, Lucian, I hope you live so we can meet again.
For every time we deny our joy and our love, and for every time we either choke back our words and say something that betrays our thoughts and feelings, the more and more we feel like the earth will swallow us whole. It may take time, years or decades even, but nothing can withstand the erosion caused by the pain and regret of dissimulation.
This is all an illusion, but there is truth within illusions. And when the illusion fades, the truth will still resonate within you. When you return to reality, what should you do? Try to remember your former self. Remember how you used to feel. Remember what you used to want.
There is great relief that comes from dredging up our authentic selves, but there is also great danger. Even though society has come a considerable way in accepting queer people, the expenses of coming out can still be steep. It can be becoming alienated from or ostracized by friends and family. It can be the loss of employment and the limiting of opportunities. It can be a drastic increase in the risk of violence and harm. Coming out is not safe, but staying in the closet is hazardous as well. And to repair one's authentic self takes more than one act or proclamation. It is often an ordeal that demands the support and community of true friends and found family. But making it through to the other side of this struggle, we can find ourselves in a place we honestly can call home. Here we can not only express and be our real selves, but we can love as and be loved for who we truly are. Through all the precarity and hardship, there is no greater joy than resurrecting our buried self. Hey, guess what? After writing what's looking like a 90-plus minute video essay about how cool Valkyrie Profile is, it's the part of the script where I make sure to communicate to everyone that it's not a perfect game. Unfortunately, because we're living in the era of social media where hyperbolic takes are the norm, I do think it is prudent to let y'all know that I don't believe Valkyrie Profile is some sort of flawless masterpiece. Honestly, speaking of the game in general, I have a lot of notes. The intro is terribly paced, and I'm surprised anybody stuck around to play this game after about an hour spent mostly by our characters narrating back to us the scenes we just saw. The writing in general drifts with melodrama, and it's hard to get overtly invested in character stories because there's just not that much surprise possible. We know they're going to die. The English localization is of its time.
I should have been the one to fill your dark soul with light!
Which is to say, it's not good, despite some bright spots. It's very clear that voice actors often had lines shoved in front of them with no story or game context to go off of, because these line readings are all over the place.
Yes! Welcome to Valhalla.
What? Using platforming mechanics is very cool and novel, but it feels unrefined, and most of the dungeon designs fail to utilize it well. The dungeons are also commonly pretty flat and boring overall. I could go on, but the point of this section is not to review the game. I want to spend my time here going over the 3 readings I just presented to you and earnestly discuss their flaws, at least the ones that I can see right now. In particular, I want to hone in on gaps in awareness, their clunkier metaphors and story devices, and the other ways they fall a bit short. Let it be known that I stand by all of these readings, but this channel is all about critical appreciation, and the most vital ingredient of critical appreciation is honesty. So let's come back around to Valkyrie Profile's anti-imperialism. Colonialist plunder in the real world is primarily perpetuated by the Anglosphere and Western Europe on regions such as South America, Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and various Pacific islands. So Valkyrie Profile takes a strong stand against imperialism. Cool. Just one question though, where are black and brown people in this game? Especially since they have been the vast majority of imperialism's victims from several centuries in the past up to and ongoing in the present day. This oversight, if you can call it that, undermines Valkyrie Profile's impassioned takedown of imperialism a lot. Even Berserk, which as I noted earlier is clearly one of the game's direct influences, shows us characters such as Casca, Pippin, and General Boscan. Is this game just allergic to melanin? Now, I can already see you dweebs frantically typing in my comment section. So hold up, what do we have here?
Well, actually, it's a work of fiction based on Northern European mythology. Why is this an issue?
So yes, astute observations there, gang. It's a work of fiction, which means its creators can do practically anything they want. You know that actually begs the question more than dismisses it, right? This defense is instantly discredited as we see that Tri-Ace have already gone ahead and presented an ethnicity and culture outside of Midgar's ostensibly Europeanish majority. In Valkyrie Profile we have the nation of Yamato, a readily apparent analog of Japan. The characters from Yamato resemble Japanese people and have Japanese names. We see samurai and hear references to miso soup and Shinto shrines. So obviously the Norse mythology conceit certainly didn't stop this Japanese game studio from representing their own people and culture in the game. So what exactly was stopping Tri-Ace from putting in some black and brown player characters, or taking one of the other nation states and making it something other than a generic white European country? Now, I generally advocate for writing what you know, that it's fraught to write characters and narratives for which you don't have the appropriate life experience to draw upon. And it's not my place to judge, given my own Mayo-like complexion, but it certainly seems like a lot of Japanese pop culture depictions of black people are, well, not great. That said, the answer can't just be to pretend that black and brown people don't exist. Maybe hire some POC writers, or barring that, just write a character of color like you would any other character. Just a few suggestions. I mentioned earlier how Lenneth performing traditional masculinity while presenting overtly feminine plays a small part in both the queer and feminist readings of Valkyrie Profile. But when looking at both of these readings simultaneously, there's a bit of dissonance there. I don't think you can, on one hand, use this to present a queer allegory, while in the other, use such transgressiveness as a red flag about the harmful qualities of patriarchy. This is why I deliberately try to de-emphasize this in the queer reading, because again, I think the queerness of Lenneth's story is much more circumstantial. That is, it's much more about how Lenneth's story resembles the queer experience than anything else. Furthermore, it's possible to look at this story as Lenneth regaining her femininity, and that being the point where things are set right. Some might read this along the lines of the defrosting ice queen trope, where a reserved or supposedly uptight woman learns to become more affable and exuberant. There's not a lot there, but it does provide just enough for a reactionary viewpoint to latch onto. I could see a Chuddo trying to argue that Valkyrie Profile is somehow advocating for women to return to being more traditionally feminine, or some nonsense along those lines. You would have to ignore a lot of the greater context of the story, for sure, like how she essentially replaces Odin as the most powerful deity in all the worlds of Yggdrasil. And do you really think Lucian is the top in this relationship? Come on now. So I want to make one last editing time addendum here, and I wanted to address that the story does have a very strong savior narrative to it, in that it's about one person who is in a very privileged position and who defects from decadence, and she saves the day by doing so. I think we need to criticize that. I think for the things that I'm talking about here, it's not going to be the work of one person. And I also think those of us who are privileged need to be wary of this mindset of being a savior, of thinking that we're the hero of the story when this is a collective effort. When Lenneth awakens her powers of creation, why does she recreate Valhalla? Remaking Asgard as a realm makes sense, but restoring Valhalla and its palatial grandeur is suspicious. Now, we don't know for sure how or even if Lenneth rules over the worlds of Yggdrasil as the story ends right after defeating Loki. But replacing Odin would not mean much if the old structures of power are reinstated. And replicating the literal structures of Valhalla is a bit of an uneasy visual in this regard. One last thing that I'd like to address with these readings. I mentioned how these power structures built on domination and never-ending accumulation will inevitably reach a point of unsustainability and collapse. I want to stress that I am not arguing for passivity on our part. We can't just sit back and wait for these systems of oppression to blow up. If anything, their inevitable demise is a cause for more urgency, not less. Because there is also the possibility that the replacements to these systems are even worse, especially if we are not involved. But what I want us to take away from this is hope and optimism. I want us to see that these oppressive hierarchies are not eternal and are rapidly approaching their end. We need to recognize the opportunity before us. This will be our chance to create a truly egalitarian society. But we need to put in the work right here, right now. We can start by resisting and undermining the current power structures. Most importantly, by building these new systems that serve us all. Valkyrie Profile is not a perfect game, but honestly, I'm okay with that, because what game is? What is more important is that this game very clearly has its heart in the right place. It says and does things to disrupt and challenge hegemony and the status quo, not just in video games and fantasy media, but in our real world as well. Sure, it's a bit rough around the edges in places, but as far as I'm concerned, it sticks the landing on the things that really matter. Valkyrie Profile is anti-imperialist. Valkyrie Profile is feminist. Valkyrie Profile is queer. Valkyrie Profile is revolutionary. The morning comes, the night decays, the watchmen leave their stations. The graces burst, the spices shed, the linen wrapped up. The bones of death, the covering clay, the sinew shrunk and dried. Reviving shake, inspiring move, breathing, awakening, spring like redeemed captives when their bonds and bars are burst. Let the slave grinding at the mill run out into the field. Let him look up into the heavens and laugh in the bright air. Let the enchained soul, shut up in darkness and in sighing, whose face has never seen a smile in 30 weary years, rise and look out. His chains are loose, his dungeon doors are open, and let his wife and children return from the oppressor's scourge. They look behind at every step and believe it is a dream, singing, "The sun has left his blackness and has found a fresher morning, and the fair moon rejoices in the clear and cloudless night, for empire is no more, and now the lion and wolf shall cease."